Most people assume that if the Exodus actually happened, if 2 million Israelites truly walked out of Egypt under a column of fire, Egypt would have recorded it. There would be a stele, a papyrus, a pharaoh's inscription somewhere boasting of his triumph or lamenting his defeat. And when skeptics point out that such an inscription doesn't exist, they treat it as the end of the conversation, as proof that the whole story is myth. But here's what nobody teaches in those debates. Egypt never recorded its defeats, not once, not anywhere. It was silence born of ignorance, it was silence born of policy. And the moment you understand how Egyptian royal scribes actually worked, what they were permitted to write and what they were forbidden to mention, the silence itself becomes the most powerful piece of evidence you did not know you were looking at. Let me be honest with you about where the scholarly debate actually stands. This is not a simple question. There are credible archaeologists and Egyptologists, serious scholars with serious credentials, who do not believe the biblical Exodus happened as described. Their argument rests primarily on silence. No Egyptian text names Moses. No plague inscription has ever been found. No royal record describes 600,000 Hebrew slaves being set free. And so the argument goes, an event this massive would have left traces. It did not. Therefore, it did not happen. That is a reasonable challenge. And honestly, that's not an unfair position if you assume Egyptian scribes operated the way modern historians do. But they did not. And that difference changes everything. Our first witness is not an archaeologist. It is the Egyptian pharaohs themselves. Specifically, the practice scholars call Damnatio memoriae, the systematic erasure of uncomfortable history. Consider what happened to Pharaoh Akhenaten. He ruled Egypt for 17 years. He built an entirely new capital city. He transformed the state religion. He was one of the most consequential rulers in Egyptian history. And after his death, his own successors spent decades methodically erasing every trace of his existence. They chiseled his name off monuments. They dismantled his temples stone by stone. They struck his name from the official king lists. Why? Because he was an embarrassment, a deviation from what Egypt wanted history to say it was. Now apply that same logic to the Exodus. Imagine you are the scribe of a pharaoh who just lost 600,000 slaves, the foundation of his entire building economy, who watched 10 catastrophic plagues tear through the Nile Delta, whose firstborn son died in a single night. Would you record that? Would any Egyptian scribe put that on a granite stele and stand it in the Temple of Amun for all of Egypt to read? The answer is self-evident. The silence of the Egyptian record is not evidence against the Exodus. It is exactly what we would predict from a civilization that erased its own pharaohs. But let us move from what Egypt chose not to record to what the ground beneath Egypt has refused to keep hidden. Our second witness is a city. The site is called Tel el-Daba. It sits in the eastern Nile Delta, the region the Bible calls Goshen. Beginning in 1966, Austrian Egyptologist Manfred Bietak led one of the most significant excavations in the history of biblical archaeology at this site. What he found was extraordinary. Beneath centuries of accumulated sediment, in the precise location the Bible identifies as the home of the Israelites, Bietak's team uncovered a massive ancient city. Its ancient name was Avaris, and it was not Egyptian. The architecture was Semitic, consistent with a population that had migrated from Canaan. The burial practices were Semitic. The pottery was Semitic. The household layouts matched Canaanite domestic structures, not Egyptian ones. And, at its height, the Semitic population of Avaris grew to an estimated 30,000 people. A foreign nation living within Egypt, in the region of Goshen, for centuries. Think about that. Now, here is the crucial point that often gets lost. BTAC's excavation also revealed something remarkable in the later layers of the site. The Semitic population, which had been expanding and thriving, suddenly disappears. Not destroyed, not conquered, not killed in battle. The evidence of violent destruction is not there, just gone. The city they built was later repurposed by the Egyptians. The Semitic inhabitants simply ceased to be present. What happened to 30,000 Semitic residents of the Eastern Nile Delta? The archaeological record does not say. BTAC himself has carefully avoided making direct connections to the biblical Exodus. That is the correct scholarly caution. But the question remains open and unanswered. A large foreign Semitic population in the right location disappears suddenly from the Egyptian record, at a time period consistent with the biblical Exodus. That is not proof, but it is precisely the kind of evidence we should expect to find. And we found it. Our third witness is a document sitting in the Brooklyn Museum right now. It is called Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446. It was written in Egypt in hieratic script approximately 1700 BC, just after the period scholars associate with Joseph. It is a list of 95 household servants belonging to an Egyptian noblewoman named Merneptah. 40 of those 95 servants have Semitic names. Several of those names are specifically Hebrew, and one of those names, one name on this list, is Shifra. If that name sounds familiar, it should. In Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, the Hebrew midwife who defied Pharaoh's direct order to kill Hebrew infant boys is named Shifra. Here is a woman with that exact name listed as a servant in Egypt in a document that predates Moses by generations. This papyrus does not prove the Exodus, but it proves something skeptics have denied for over a century: that Hebrew people were present in Egypt as servants before the Exodus narrative even begins. Now, here is where the evidence becomes even more specific. Egyptologist James Hoffmeyer spent decades studying the language of the Exodus text itself. What he found is remarkable. The Hebrew text of Exodus is embedded with Egyptian loanwords, vocabulary that does not derive from Canaanite Hebrew, but from Egyptian. The word for Moses' basket in the Nile is not a Hebrew word. It is a transliteration of the Egyptian word for debyet. The word for reeds is Egyptian. The word for the Nile is not the standard Hebrew word for river. It is a transliteration of the Egyptian word for the Nile specifically. And the name Moses himself, Moshe in Hebrew, derives from the Egyptian root msi, meaning born of. This was an extremely common element in Egyptian royal names. Thutmose, Amos, Ramesses, all carry the same root. The author of Exodus was not writing mythology invented 1,000 years later by priests in Babylonian exile. He was writing with the vocabulary of someone who had lived it. Now, let us turn to the most significant single artifact in this entire discussion, the one Egypt itself produced, and the one Egypt never intended to help us. In 1209 BC, Pharaoh Merneptah erected a granite victory stele celebrating his military campaigns. It was discovered in 1896 by the great Egyptologist Sir Flinders Petrie in the ruins of Merneptah's mortuary temple at Thebes. It stands 7.5 feet tall, and carved into it, in hieroglyphic script, is the first non-biblical reference to the people of Israel ever found in the ancient world. The inscription reads, "Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more." Merneptah was boasting about defeating the Israelites in Canaan. He was not trying to help the biblical case. He was an Egyptian pharaoh writing military propaganda intended to glorify his own power. And yet, in the act of dismissing Israel, he confirmed their existence. He confirmed they were a distinct people group. He confirmed they were present in the ancient Near East, not as wandering nomads, but as a settled people substantial enough to be worth recording a military victory over. And here is the chronological implication that is rarely explained clearly. This inscription dates to 1209 BC. If Israel was already a settled people in Canaan by 1209 BC, established enough to be defeated by Pharaoh in a military campaign, that means they left Egypt significantly earlier. The book of 1 Kings states that Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the Exodus. Solomon's temple is well dated. Working backward, that calculation places the Exodus at approximately 1446 BC. Merneptah Stele, erected in 1209 BC, confirms Israel was in Canaan, consistent with having left Egypt in 1446 BC. Egypt's own victory inscription, meant to magnify Egyptian power and humiliate Israel, inadvertently handed us a chronological anchor for the entire Exodus story. If this investigation into the buried evidence of Scripture is meaningful to you, if you believe that history and faith are not enemies but allies, I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel. We are building a library of exactly this kind of inquiry, and this is only the beginning. Now I want to address a piece of evidence you may have encountered before. And I want to be honest with you about both its strengths and its significant limitations, because that intellectual honesty is what separates serious inquiry from wishful thinking. The Ipuwer Papyrus is an ancient Egyptian literary text, a document of lamentations that describes what appears to be a catastrophic societal collapse. It describes water turning red, darkness covering the land, livestock dying, children dying, a reversal of the social order in which slaves are freed and masters are brought low. For over a century, some scholars and apologists have pointed to this document as a direct Egyptian record of the 10 plagues. And honestly, that instinct is not entirely without basis. The parallels are genuinely striking. But here is where precision is required. The scholarly debate around the Ipuwer Papyrus is real, and it is unresolved. The papyrus itself was copied sometime around 1200 BC, but the original composition may be older. More significantly, many Egyptologists classify it as a generalized literary lamentation, a genre common in ancient Egyptian literature, rather than a record of a specific historical event. No serious Catholic apologist should pretend otherwise. What we can say, honestly, is this. The Ipuwer Papyrus describes imagery consistent with the societal collapse that the Exodus would have caused. It is not a smoking gun. The dating is disputed. The genre is disputed. The connection requires assumptions we cannot prove. But it is a cultural memory of catastrophe, written in Egypt, preserved by Egyptians, that no one has fully and satisfactorily explained. And it sits alongside all the other evidence we have examined today. The vanished Semitic population of Avaris, the Hebrew names in Egyptian servant records, the Egyptian vocabulary embedded in the text of Exodus that no Babylonian exile could have possessed, and Pharaoh's own granite stele confirming Israel's existence and location in the ancient world. No single piece of evidence is conclusive on its own, but evidence does not work that way. It never does. It converges. And now, I want to reframe the entire question. because this is where everything shifts. We have been asking, did Egypt confirm the Exodus? But that is the wrong question. The right question is, what kind of evidence should we actually expect to find, given how Egypt actually operated? And when we ask that question, the picture changes entirely. Egypt did not record defeats. Egypt did not memorialize the departure of its slave labor force. Egypt systematically and deliberately erased embarrassing chapters of its own history. They chiseled Akhenaten's name off monuments across the entire country. They destroyed Hatshepsut's images after her death. They rewrote entire campaigns as victories when they were at best stalemates. An event as catastrophic as the Exodus, the loss of an entire workforce, the death of a crown prince, 10 disasters tearing through the Nile Delta, the humiliation of the most powerful civilization on Earth, would not have been inscribed on a temple wall. It would have been buried, erased, and the erasure would have been thorough. What we should expect to find is indirect evidence, cultural fingerprints, population data, foreign archaeological signatures in the right location, linguistic borrowing, external confirmations from neighboring peoples. That is precisely what we have found. Not a confession from Pharaoh, but the kind of evidence that survives when powerful institutions spend centuries trying to make history disappear. Let me be direct about what this means for faith. The Catholic tradition has never been afraid of historical inquiry. The Church Fathers, Origen, Eusebius, Augustine, engaged the intellectual challenges of their day with confidence, not defensiveness. The Second Vatican Council's document Dei Verbum affirms that Scripture is expressed through human history, human culture, and human language, which means that engaging that history rigorously is not an act of skepticism. It is an act of reverence. The evidence we have examined today does not prove every detail of the Exodus account in the way a courtroom demands proof, but it does something more important. It dismantles the confident dismissal. It removes the ground from under the argument that the Exodus is simply a myth invented by priests in Babylonian exile with no connection to historical reality. There is a massive Semitic city in the right location whose population vanished without a military explanation. Hebrew names in Egyptian servant records from the generation before Moses. Egyptian vocabulary in the text that no later scribe could have embedded. And Pharaoh's own military inscription confirming Israel's existence. The skeptics are correct that we do not have a signed confession from Pharaoh, but the Catholic tradition asks a different question. Has history demonstrated that the foundational claim that a Semitic people lived in Egypt, served as a workforce, and departed is historically impossible? And the answer, increasingly, is no. The ground of Egypt itself has begun to speak, and what it says is not, "This could not have happened." What it says in the pottery and the papyri and the population records and the very language of the text is, something happened here. Something large enough to anchor a nation's identity for 3,000 years. Something that Egypt, for all its power, could not entirely erase. The most sophisticated challenge to the Exodus has never been the absence of a single decisive inscription. The most sophisticated challenge has been the claim that the absence of evidence is itself evidence of absence, that an event this massive could not have been hidden. But now you know what those arguments do not account for. Egypt was not a modern nation with independent historians and a free press. It was an absolutist civilization whose entire propaganda apparatus existed for one purpose: to make Pharaoh look invincible, to make Egypt look eternal, to make its defeats disappear. The silence of the Egyptian record is not a refutation of the biblical account. It is, when you understand how Egypt actually worked, almost exactly what we would predict. History, evidence, faith. These are not enemies. They are the same investigation conducted from different angles. What do you think? Does the archaeological record change how you read the Exodus account? Is the silence of Egypt an argument against the story, or the perfectly Egyptian response imaginable? Tell me in the comments. And subscribe now, because our next investigation examines a piece of physical evidence so precise, so specific, that it has left the academic world with no comfortable explanation. The mystery is waiting.